spring of 1803, off the coast of Georgia, a ship filled with newly captured Africans ran aground. What happened next has echoed across centuries as both tragedy and triumph. Dozens of IGBO men and women chained in the belly of that vessel had already endured the unimaginable, torn from their homeland, forced across the Middle Passage, and sold into a world that promised nothing but cruelty. Yet, when faced with bondage in a foreign land, they made a choice so defiant, so haunting, that it transformed them into legend. Led by their own voices, the captives rose against their oppressors. They overpowered the crew, and as the waters of Dunbar Creek lapped against the Georgia shore, the IGBO captives refused the life that awaited them. Instead, they marched into the water, singing as they walked. The water spirit brought us home, descendants say today. To some, it was a mass suicide. To others, it was a spiritual return, a refusal to let slavery claim their bodies or their souls. The event became known as the IGBO Landing, a story whispered in communities, passed through spirituals, and reshaped into folklore of the flying Africans who rose above their chains and returned to Africa through the sky. But what truly happened that day? Why has history tried to silence their voices? And why does the IGBO Landing remain one of the most powerful acts of resistance in the dark history of slavery? The year was 1803. The humid Georgia air was thick with salt and silence as the tide crept into the marshlands near St. Simon's Island. From a distance, the waters shimmered like liquid glass, hiding centuries of memory beneath their surface. But on this particular day, Dunbar Creek would become more than a stretch of water. It would become a grave, a sanctuary, and a monument to defiance. A vessel carrying enslaved Africans had just anchored offshore. These men and women were IGBO, people of immense pride and culture, known in their homeland for valuing independence above all. Torn violently from their villages in what is now southeastern Nigeria, they had endured the unspeakable horrors of the Middle Passage. Chained in suffocating darkness, they crossed the Atlantic with only their voices as weapons, voices that sang prayers, laments, and coded messages of survival. Now, in the so-called New World, their fate was meant to be sealed. The planters of Georgia saw them not as humans, but as property, as hands to harvest rice, indigo, and cotton beneath a brutal sun. The ship's cargo was to be marched into a life of unending servitude. But destiny and the will of the IGBO had other plans. On the deck of that vessel, tension rippled like the tide itself. Whispers of revolt spread from chained mouth to chained ear. Some accounts say the captives rose up as the ship approached land, overpowering their captors. Others recall that the uprising happened upon arrival, when they realized escape was impossible. Regardless of when the spark was lit, one fact remains: these captives refused to surrender quietly to a lifetime of bondage. As the ship drifted closer to Dunbar Creek, the IGBO captives made a decision that would echo across history. Instead of bowing their heads to chains, they would take control of their own fate. The marshes, with their reeds and ghostly silence, bore witness to the impossible. Men and women standing taller than their shackles, pushing back against the tide of empire itself. They would not simply survive this crossing, they would redefine it. To understand the defiance at IGBO Landing, we must first journey back across the Atlantic, into the green heartlands of West Africa. Long before the world named them slaves, the IGBO were a proud people with deep traditions of freedom, community, and spiritual strength. In the lands of present-day southeastern Nigeria, the IGBO lived in villages bound not by kings or empires, but by councils, elders, and shared decision-making. This made them unusual compared to many centralized African kingdoms. They valued autonomy and believed each person carried within them a spark of dignity, a principle that would follow them even into captivity. The IGBO were skilled farmers, traders, and artisans. They cultivated yam, palm oil, and cassava. They traded across rivers and markets that pulsed with life. Songs and rituals carried history forward, while masquerades and festivals connected them to ancestors and spirits. Their cosmology was filled with reverence for Allah, the earth goddess, and Chukwu, the supreme deity, powers that guided their daily lives. Yet, the 18th and early 19th centuries brought storm clouds. European slavers, hungry for labor to fuel sugar, cotton, and rice plantations, targeted the West African coast. Through wars, raids, and betrayals, countless Igbo were kidnapped or sold into bondage. Ships carried them to the Americas in staggering numbers. In fact, historical records show that nearly 20% of Africans brought to British North America were of Igbo origin. For those taken, the loss was not only of land, but of lineage. Families were ripped apart, their villages emptied. Yet something endured. The Igbo carried with them their culture, their values, and above all, their fierce commitment to autonomy. That is why, when faced with the prospect of life in chains, they chose instead to confront death or transcendence on their own terms. This spirit of self-determination, born in their homeland, would fuel the haunting choice they made at the edge of Dunbar Creek. When the Igbo captives were dragged onto the shores of Georgia, the air was heavy with the smell of salt marshes and fear. They had survived the crossing of the Atlantic, a journey that had already claimed countless lives. But survival did not mean freedom, it meant another chapter of torment. In Savannah, human beings were paraded as commodities. The auction block was not simply a place of trade, it was a theater of dehumanization. Men, women, and even children were inspected like livestock. Their teeth were pried open, their arms flexed, their bodies poked and prodded for signs of strength. Buyers haggled, discussing price as though debating over barrels of rice or crates of tobacco. For the Igbo, who came from a society where every voice held value, this public spectacle was more than humiliation. It was betrayal of everything they had ever known. Here, their names were stripped away, replaced with numbers or crude labels. Here, mothers could be torn from their children, husbands from wives, brothers from sisters. The auctioneer's gavel was not just a tool of commerce, it was a weapon of erasure. But beneath the silence, resistance simmered. Some accounts suggest that during the sale and transfer from Savannah toward plantations on St. Simon's Island, whispers circulated among the captives. They knew what awaited them in the rice fields and indigo swamps, endless labor under a sun that broke bodies and shortened lives. But they also knew they still had one power left, the power to choose. And so, as they were marched toward Dunbar Creek, the Igbo captives carried with them not only the weight of chains, but also the seed of defiance. They were preparing for a decision that would shock their captors, terrify the planters, and echo through centuries as one of the boldest acts of resistance in the history of slavery. The journey from Savannah to the plantations of Georgia's barrier islands was short in distance, but infinite in dread. The Igbo captives, bound in chains, were ferried aboard a smaller vessel that would deliver them to their new masters. The waters of the Altamaha and its tributaries glimmered under the sun, yet for those on board it was no river of life. It was a river into bondage. But the Igbo were not broken. Accounts suggest that during this transfer, something extraordinary happened. The captives, though weakened by the Middle Passage and the violence of capture, rose against their captors. Whether by coordinated plan or a surge of courage in the moment, they seized their chance. The boat lurched with struggle, shouts splashing, the clash of chains against wood. Some reports say the crew was overpowered and drowned. Others claim they fled in terror as the captives forced control of the vessel. What is certain is this. At Dunbar Creek, the Igbo made a choice. Standing at the edge of enslavement, they rejected the life that awaited them. Instead, they invoked the strength of their ancestors, lifted their voices in song, and began to march, step by step, into the water. The tide swallowed chains, feet, and voices until the creek itself carried their bodies. To the white planters, it was shocking rebellion, a waste of valuable property. To the Igbo and their descendants, it was something far greater. It was not surrender, but defiance. A refusal to be owned, a return to spirit, to homeland, to dignity that no auction block could erase. In that haunting moment, the Igbo transformed a place of despair into sacred ground. Dunbar Creek became not a site of death, but a monument to choice, a declaration that even in the darkest shadow of slavery, the human will could not be chained. The shoreline of Dunbar Creek was quiet, its marsh grasses swaying as though the land itself held its breath. For the Igbo captives, this was the threshold between two worlds, the land of bondage that awaited them, and the waters that promised something else, perhaps death, perhaps freedom, perhaps home. Witnesses later spoke of the haunting power of that moment. The IGBO, still bound in chains, began to sing. The words, carried in their own tongue, rose like a tide above the silence. It was not a song of despair, but of defiance, a declaration that no master could own their spirit. Some said the song invoked the water spirits, calling on ancestors to guide them home. Others remembered the refrain as a promise that their souls would not remain in captivity. One by one they moved forward. Chains rattled as bare feet sank into the marsh mud. The water reached their ankles, then their waists, then their chests. Some struggled, some hesitated, but the current of determination pulled them together. They were not drowning, they were choosing. Choosing not to live as property, choosing not to see their children raised in bondage, choosing to meet the water as free people, not as slaves. To the white overseers watching from the shore, horror and disbelief turned to silence. What they saw as the loss of valuable cargo was, in truth, an act of spiritual warfare. The IGBO captives had denied them victory. The creek closed over the marchers, ripples spreading outward like echoes of a song that refused to die. And in that moment, Dunbar Creek was no longer just water. It became memory. It became legend. What happened at Dunbar Creek did not remain just a local story. It transformed into legend, reshaped through the voices of descendants, storytellers, and spiritual leaders. From the waters of death and defiance arose one of the most enduring myths of the African diaspora, the tale of the Flying Africans. In these stories, the IGBO did not simply drown. They rose. Some say they unfurled invisible wings, lifted by the ancestors, and flew back across the ocean to Africa. Others tell of a spiritual passage where their bodies sank but their souls soared, carried on the currents of freedom. The legend spread through whispered tales and spiritual songs, told to children by firelight and sung in fields where chains clattered in rhythm with labor. To enslaved Africans across the South, the Flying Africans became a symbol of possibility. If the IGBO could reject bondage and return home, then perhaps every enslaved person carried within them the same seed of escape. The myth was both memory and prophecy, a way of keeping alive the defiance that history sought to bury. The story shaped African American folklore for centuries. In the Gula Geechee communities of the coastal South, elders repeated the tale, calling Dunbar Creek a sacred place. In later generations, writers and artists resurrected the Flying Africans as symbols of resistance, appearing in poems, novels, and paintings. Though history books tried to reduce IGBO landing to a footnote, folklore gave it wings. In myth, the IGBO were not victims. They were heroes who chose spirit over chains, song over silence, flight over captivity. For white planners and chroniclers of the 19th century, the IGBO landing was an event best left unspoken. To acknowledge it meant admitting that enslaved people were not passive property, but human beings capable of defiance, sacrifice, and spiritual power. The rebellion at Dunbar Creek undermined the very foundations of the slave system. It revealed that control was never absolute. So in official records, the IGBO landing was buried. Mentions were brief, often dismissive, reduced to cold descriptions of loss of cargo. Plantation ledgers mourned the money lost, not the lives. Local histories omitted the story altogether, creating silence where memory should have lived. But among black communities, the memory never died. The Gula Geechee people, descendants of enslaved Africans who lived along the coastal regions of Georgia and South Carolina, preserved the tale through oral tradition. Around hearth fires, in church sermons, and through coded songs, the story of the IGBO who walked into the sea was told again and again. For them, it was not just a story of tragedy. It was a reminder of dignity, of choice, of unbroken spirit. Every retelling carried a warning that no matter how brutal slavery was, it could never erase the will to resist. The silence of white historians only made the oral memory more powerful. Generations later, anthropologists and writers would rediscover the event, treating it as a forgotten footnote. But for black families, it had never been forgotten. At Dunbar Creek, silence and memory lived side by side, one trying to erase, the other determined to keep alive. The IGBO landing was more than a single act of defiance. It became a seed planted in the soil of history. For enslaved Africans and their descendants, it symbolized that resistance was possible, even when the chains seemed unbreakable. In the decades that followed, whispers of the IGBO's final march inspired others. Slave revolts erupted across the Americas, from Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia to the massive uprisings in the Caribbean and Brazil. Each act was different in scale and outcome, but all were bound by the same truth: that human beings would never fully accept being reduced to property. For African American communities, IGBO landing became sacred ground. Local traditions held that the waters of Dunbar Creek carried spiritual power. Some elders said the creek sings, if you listen closely, the voices of those who walked into the tide echoing still. Even in the 20th century, civil rights leaders drew upon the symbolism of IGBO landing. The story was told as a reminder that freedom was worth sacrifice, and dignity could never be bought or sold. Writers, poets, and musicians reclaimed the legend. From Toni Morrison's novels to spiritual songs that echoed across churches, the IGBO's act of resistance was reborn in art. For the Gullah Geechee, it was part of cultural identity, a thread tying them back to Africa and forward into survival. In every retelling, the IGBO landing carried a message across time. You may try to chain the body, but the spirit will always find a way to rise, march, or fly. Though 2 centuries have passed since the march into Dunbar Creek, the story of IGBO landing continues to ripple outward, shaping culture, politics, and identity in ways few historic events ever could. In the Gullah Geechee communities of Georgia and South Carolina, the tale remains alive. Elders pass it down not as distant folklore, but as living truth, a story of ancestors who chose dignity over chains. Festivals, oral traditions, and sacred gatherings still honor Dunbar Creek as a place of memory, where history and spirit converge. Beyond the coastal South, IGBO landing has become a touchstone in African American literature and art. Writers such as Toni Morrison and Alex Haley wove its themes into their works, reimagining the flying Africans as metaphors of survival and transcendence. Musicians, too, echoed the story in spirituals, jazz, and blues, embedding the legend into America's cultural DNA. In modern activism, the IGBO landing resonates as a symbol of resistance against oppression. During the Civil Rights Movement, it was evoked as proof that the fight for freedom was ancient and unbroken. Even today, when communities speak of reclaiming dignity in the face of injustice, the March into the Sea is remembered as a declaration: we will not be owned. Global conversations about slavery, diaspora, and forced labor also draw on its memory. The IGBO landing bridges past and present, reminding us that the fight for human freedom is not finished. Its echoes remind us that history is not simply behind us, it is alive, pulsing, demanding to be heard. The waters of Dunbar Creek remain calm today. Marsh grasses bend gently in the wind, and the tide ebbs and flows as if nothing remarkable ever happened here. To a passerby, it is only a quiet stretch of Georgia's coast, but to those who remember, it is hallowed ground. The IGBO who walked into the sea left behind no written testimonies, no monuments carved in stone. What they left instead was something more enduring: a song. A song carried in whispers, in spirituals, in folklore that refused to fade. It is the sound of defiance echoing through centuries. The silence of official history could not bury it. Plantation records may have reduced the captives to cargo, but memory elevated them into ancestors, martyrs, heroes. Their march into the water became more than an act of despair. It became a choice that redefined freedom itself.